and concentrate when I'm not looking at the trees outside. So as you heard, my title for today is Old Trees Are Our Parents, Old Growth, New Kin, Forest Time, Artwork. And I've tried to shorten this so that we'll have time for discussion, but also because we are in a video situation, and I know that that is more difficult to sit through. So let's see how I do on the timing. As you heard, in a recent essay I offered, oh, and I should just say that I will be reading from an essay, and so I ask for your attention. Thank you, thank you, thank you. In a recent essay, as you heard, I offered some thoughts about how we might bring together age studies and environmental humanities to address matters of aging in the urgency of the Anthropocene and planetary degradation. Among my suggestions was the study of aging across species with a lens on longevity, focus of your conference, and two concepts of measurement associated with it, life expectancy and the lifespan. Today, I turn my attention to the form of life we call trees, our relation to them, their relation to us, and our mutual entanglements. I focus on the fictional trees we find in Richard Powers' monumental novel, The Overstory, which was published in 2018. I have become, you might say, obsessed with this novel. I just think it is one of the great novels of the 21st century. My thoughts about aging in the Anthropocene through the frame of post-human aging have been powerfully shaped by this novel and the many books and articles it's inspired me to read. We're aged by culture, as Margaret Goulet has perfectly put it, her emphasis placed on the negative association sutured to being old in capitalist societies. But what would it mean to be aged by trees? To grow old with trees as our companion species, to understand with the 19th century American author Henry David Thoreau that old trees are our parents. What would it be to be inspired by the experience of these fictional characters in old age and by the work of people in late life who live in concert with trees? For me, the Overstory serves as a guide. We'd listen to sounds at the lowest frequencies, sounds that we haven't heard before, the language of trees. We'd honor the science of the biosocial planetary world. The science is a through path in my talk in which we make our home. Joining it with indigenous knowledges and practices, we'd be humbled, we'd be strengthened, understanding old growth in relation to humans as well as to forests. We would ideally dwell in the embrace of our kinship with the living world. Almost 45 years ago, in a book entitled Biophilia, the biologist E.O. Wilson declared that as humans, we have an innate tendency to affiliate with forms of life, to connect with the natural world, which is permeated with aesthetic value, that's very important, and of which we're a part. Wilson and contemporary theorists of the post-human, that is to say, those who draw our attention to our kinship with other beings, together join hands here, appreciating the world of life, living and dying in tune with it, and as a part of it. This is a step for me toward an ecology of being and of life, offering a sense of belonging to something elemental, something vital, and something old, and hopefully providing us, as we prepare to leave life as individuals and as a species, perhaps paradoxically with a sense of place. Particular trees and specific species of trees animate the lives. This is a close reading of a novel. And so I'm going to sketch just a bit for those of you who haven't read it. what it's about. Particular trees and specific species of trees animate the lives of the 9 main human characters, 4 of whom powers the author follows into old age. These trees themselves are characters, they're actors. The chestnut, the mulberry, the maple, the banyan tree, the redwood, the beech, and the oak. The novel is populated with a myriad of trees and other species as well, and countless more, an abundance of the variety of life in the shape of trees, their differences from each other, so extraordinarily more varied than are the very so slight differences among humans. Imagine there are some 10,000 species of trees that have been identified. I think the diversity is just dazzling. Some of these main human characters grow up with trees key to their childhoods, and others come passionately to trees later on. The novel is set in the United States, and from across the United States, 5 of these characters intersect in California midway through the novel by virtue of their ardent commitment to the well-being and the very survival of trees. Trees at risk of being murdered by corporations whose business is to cut them down and to extract them from the land. The plot, such as it is set in motion by the activism on the part of these characters, their protests and their standoffs on behalf of trees invariably turn horrific and violent, with aftermaths unforeseen. But today I'm going to set aside the violence and single out 4 scenes, sometimes just a setting, 4 scenes that offer what I think of as parables of post-human growing old and aging that address the following questions. First, what is the place of humans in relation to trees in terms of longevity? Second, what is the new scientific understandings of root systems of trees and the genetic life worlds of humans and trees that bring us closer together? Third, how can we attain deep knowledge and gratitude for trees and come to an acceptance of their teaching? And fourth, you've heard an echo of this already, how can we imagine solidarity on the part of descendants of settlers with Indigenous people and their ways of being? I focus on 4 of the major characters who by the novel's end are some 70 years old. So this is about representation of aging. And these characters, each in their own way, envisioning a reforestation of the planet, even as nothing could appear less certain, given the all-consuming rapaciousness of runaway capitalism. A 5th character, in middle age, models the formation of ties with Indigenous people who make their home in the forest. Pervading the entire novel is a capacious view of more than human relationships, entailing feelings of what I call sanctuary. And these feelings matter, they matter enormously. The fundamental issues that permeate the lives and the last years of these characters in the overstory are moral. They're not physical, they're not social, financial, or economic. They're predominantly moral. What have they done, these people, these characters, that they should not have done? They're asking themselves these questions. What can they do at this point in their lives, in old age, as they age into old age? What can they do at this point in their lives that is right and good? How does the world of trees help them address these questions? And how can they open themselves to green feelings, which include understanding, acceptance, and deep respect? I'll be doing quite a bit of this. The language is so beautiful in this novel that I'd wish to be able to simply just read entire passages to you if you haven't read the novel yourself. Beautiful language. However, turning to scenes in the novel and drawing you into close reading with me, as I hope I do, it allows me to tell you, if briefly and succinctly, stories from the overstory, persuading you, I hope, to make the novel a part of your life. And it strikes me that here it is going on midnight in Seattle in the United States. And reading at that time of night would really be called reading bedtime stories. I know you're at a completely different point in time, but try to imagine some of these scenes as bedtime stories. I'll devote more of my attention to the first scene, which is, as you will see, actually two. The first one, the character of Patricia Westerford, when she's a young woman in her 30s, and the second, when she's in her 70s. So first section, entitled Old Growth and the Sublime. In the overstory, the human lifespan in the comparative company of trees is altogether unexceptional, minuscule, in fact. In the novel, the idea of the great chain of being that has so permeated the Western world, with the position of mankind crowning that of animals, plants, and minerals, is null and void. People are not, we read, the apex species they think they are. This is not our world with trees in it. It's a world of trees where humans have just arrived. Highlighted in the overstory is the expansive lifespan of multiple species of trees, dwarfing the outer limits of the human lifespan, which for our purposes, I place at 125. 125. Unlike humans who, as they move into old age, we typically diminish in height and in strength, in the world of trees, age and size typically increase together. I suspect that for most people in the United States, the first species of trees associated with great size and longevity that comes to mind is what we call the giant redwood of California. And I'm going to ask you, what would be that tree in Turkey? Or what would be that tree in your own community? And in fact, in the novel, one of the key events involves a redwood on the coast of California that's targeted by a timber company owned by a multi-million-dollar corporation. The tree is 1,000 years old. It's a legacy tree. It's the largest, strongest, widest, oldest, surest, sanest living thing that one of the main characters has ever seen. It's an individual. This tree is presented as an individual, a world unto itself, and it has a name, Mimas. It's a noble redwood that's viciously murdered in the overstory in a corporate act of aboricide. In contrast to 1,000 years old, what's been identified and called exceptional longevity in humans in so-called developed countries is associated with living to the age of 85, 1,000. These trees attain what we'd better call a great age rather than old age, which typically carries a negative association from disregard to repulsion in our ageist capitalist societies. Instead, the longevity and height of the giant redwoods, along with other trees in the overstory, inspire in these main human characters awe and veneration. Humans shrink in comparison, with humility being the only possible response, the only possible moral response, I should add. So rather than single out giant redwoods as evoking in humans the sublime, I want to turn to a scene in the novel that introduces longevity on an altogether different scale. Featured is the young scientist Patricia Westerford, I mentioned, who, driving west across the United States relatively early in the novel, pauses to visit an immense aspen grove, aspen being a kind of a kind of tree. This grove is a national treasure in the United States, known to very few people, in fact. The site of one of the oldest and largest living beings on Earth, covering 100 acres, this is a grove of trees, is stunning. It's absolutely stunning. And Westerford, looking at it out over a ridge, then parks her car, draws closer into the woods, and immerses herself in this white-gray room, a pillared foyer to the afterlife, responding to its pale, delicate colors, its scent, its inimitable sound, offering her what the Canadian botanist Diana Beresford Kroger has called, and I think this is a beautiful phrase, a cathedral feeling, a cathedral feeling. It's a sacred space, a benevolent space, and it's a moment of deep intimacy, suffused with aesthetic meaning and the reassuring sense of protection that there's life after death, some kind of life after death and after life. But for me, what ultimately distinguishes her experience of the aspen grove as sublime from similar experiences of the landscape is her knowledge, and her knowledge coming from her work as a scientist. And this is where science comes in again as a through theme in my reflections. It's her knowledge and her research about what goes on below the ground, not above the ground. That this is a single organism, these 100 acres covered in this grove of aspen. This grove is united by the root system, stretching across, as I mentioned, 100 acres, and a system, a life that may be as much as 1,000,000 years old. 1,000,000 years old, imagine. Longevity of astounding proportions, a potentially unlimited lifespan if things remain healthy on the planet. Thus, for her, the sublime, the feeling of apprehending a beautiful living whole whose scale dwarfs the human. Enormous, the grove is a figure of the collective and collaborative nature of trees. It's unique, it's elaborate, it's an even lavish embodiment of what Westerford's research has definitively revealed. That trees communicate through their root systems, signaling each other, sharing resources, protecting one another, forming a forest that exists both above and below the ground, that trees are social beings, moreover, that there are trees who in their great age, near death, could be said to sacrifice themselves for those younger, a prime example being that of a tree falling in the forest to make way for young trees to grow in the light. The decay of its trunk and branches providing nourishment for still others. These trees are ancient benefactors. This is one of my favorite lines in the novel. There are no individuals, we read. There aren't even separate species, everything in the forest is the forest. And for the remainder of the novel, that includes Patricia Westerford. She's been ostracized by her profession, which disdains her research. And in the face of that, she resolves to make her life, and that's why she was crossing the United States, to make her life, which means to find her home in the forest. And she does. Reaching the old growth forests on the west coast of the United States, she chooses to live in the company of long-lived Douglas firs, just encircled by forest. In joining an old growth forest, she becomes a part of that whole, bringing with her the valuable entanglement of different traditions of knowledge. In the novel, her character serves as the locus of knowledge from vastly different traditions, the epistemology of science on the one hand, and the epistemology of the botanical world. She is the forest. In her 70s, having struggled with moral questions, in other words, we are now fast forwarding from her being in her 30s to being in her 70s. In her 70s, having struggled with moral questions that are at once deeply existential and broadly planetary, she asks herself this pressing question: what is the best single thing a person can do for tomorrow's world? And if I can make a kind of joke at this point, I just came from a conference where we discussed very seriously not taking planes any longer to attend conferences. And this was not my reason for not coming, but it strikes me that that is one good thing that we can do at this point for tomorrow's world. Her answer to that question was not to take a plane. Her answer to that question is to turn her knowledge into a form of action. She launches a new project as a scientist in her 70s, creating a living archive of the seeds of trees from around the world, a resource that might ultimately serve as a key to the survival of multiple species of the plant world. In other words, like a Douglas fir, in her old age, she's become a benefactor. A Douglas fir is a benefactor tree, providing sun, as it were, in the shape of seeds that will form new growth, that is to say, trees. The phrase old growth is associated with forests that are largely undisturbed from their beginnings. The primary examples in the overstory are the magnificent redwood forests of California and Oregon, two of our states. And within capitalist culture, old and growth are antithetical terms. Old is associated with loss, stagnation, and decline. By contrast, in the character of Westerford, we find an inspiring figure of old growth, one who puts the lie to the contradiction of old and growth, one who's learned so much from the gifts given by trees, one who lives with trees. And we can say the same of the other three characters who at novel's end are by their own reckoning old: Ray Brinkman, Dorothy Cazaly, and Mimi Ma. Section 2. New kin and feelings of family. For me, the most magical scene in the overstory involves a married couple, Ray Brinkman and Dorothy Cazaly, now almost 70. They've lived out their very pedestrian lives as a married couple quietly. Early in their marriage, it's actually on their first anniversary, Ray determines to give the gift of a life to Dorothy, to offer her a thing that grows, to plant a tree. Planting trees underscores the profound void they both acutely feel in remaining childless, a loss intensified when Ray, now much older, has a massive stroke that leaves him confined to his bed and virtually unable to read. Excuse me, unable to speak. How will he sustain his life? And what will be his legacy? Will there be new branches to the family tree? The world of the backyard outside Ray's window, they live in a house on the edge of Minneapolis. The world of the backyard outside Ray's window becomes a lifeline, even a passion. Together, Dorothy and Ray read books about trees, learning how to name them in the fullness of their attributes and histories. But one tree, it's the tree framed by the window, is a mystery. In time, following the work of naturalists and botanists, they're doing research. They come to realize it is impossibly a chestnut tree, America's perfect vanished tree. It's a tree that long ago disappeared from the United States, predominantly on the East Coast. It was destroyed by a deadly fungus. It was not possible to find anywhere a chestnut tree, but here it is 1,000 miles away, so far beyond what had been its natural habitat, with the rest of chestnuts gone. It draws them together in the evening light, and this is also an aesthetic vision. It draws them together in the evening light as the sun glints green off their chestnuts, scalloped leaves, with Dorothy musing. It's sometimes hard to say whether a tree is a single thing or whether it's a million. In fact, Powers tells us, we learn it's both. It's a million things, it's a single thing. And we saw this too in the vision of the aspen grove. It was a million things and a single thing. What comes next is an illumination. Ray, thinking back through the years of nurturing seedlings of trees, he understands in an instant the bond that connects the three of them. In the 6 words he struggles to speak, he tells his wife a story. 6 words, and this is it. Planted it, the chestnut, our daughter. Planted it, the chestnut, our daughter. It's a story of kinship across species. He's thinking of a seedling that he had nurtured from a seed. Much could be said at this point about the classical cultural tradition in the West of transformation across beings, of humans struck into trees by the gods, for example. I want to instead suggest 2 other ways of understanding this remarkable scene. So first, the overstory joins compelling cultural work that recognizes the urgent need to expand our ideas of what constitutes a family and kin. In the overstory, the concept of kin reverberates in a much larger orbit as well, one that transcends a single species, entangling trees and humans in mutually enhancing ways. The sociologist in the United States, Ruha Benjamin, calls this meta kinship, the expansion of relatedness beyond the level of biological species. The work of the cultural theorist Donna Haraway, gifted thinker, along with that of the cultural anthropologist Anna Singh, extraordinary work she's done, is also salient here. As Haraway writes in a little book, and I actually have it right here on my stack of books, this little book, Making Kin, Not Population, Making Kin, Not Population. For those of you who are readers of Foucault, you'll hear Foucault in Population. Kin, she says, must mean something other, more than entities tied by ancestry or genealogy. including population, family, and species. Kin making is making persons, not necessarily as individuals or as humans. In the overstory, trees are regarded by these main characters as persons. In this scene, a man looking outside a window as at his daughter. In this scene, a tree is literally a daughter to a human couple, a tree daughter nurtured to adulthood, a legacy. In the novel, this vision is not only metaphorical, it's also literalized, and that's its power. Ray, the father, the husband, in the heightened understanding of their kinship across species, remember, he's in his 70s, almost 70, he has another crucial insight that has been made possible, as it were, by this understanding, one that prompts the two of them in their 70s to undertake an imaginative act of resistance, resistance that's local, situated in their yard. They commit to doing nothing. The town has insisted that they need to clean up their yard, that it's been growing over with plants, that they need to, in a sense, deforest their lawn, and they refuse. They continue to let life flourish, understanding that life is what grows. Life is what grows. And in an enthralling sign of life, the forest, regenerating and rewilding, comes rushing back. And I just pause here to note that, with one exception, none of the main characters in the overstory have children, human children. Instead, their vision is of growing forests. In the overstory, old trees are our parents, as Thoreau wrote in 1855. They're also our descendants, our children. Second, much as the character Patricia Westerford brings her scientific knowledge of the function of root systems of trees to her sight of the stunning aspen grove, I want as a reader to point to recent research that amplifies and deepens our understanding of the biological tree of life. In other words, I want to read into the science of the tree of life in tandem with the novel. From Darwin, we received the model of a branching tree to represent evolution. But recent research reveals what the gifted science writer David Quammen has marvelously called the tangled tree. And I also have his book right here at my desk, The Tangled Tree. He has another wonderful book called Spillover, which is about viruses predominantly. Superb book. Everyone should read it. One way to think differently about kin is in lateral terms. Thinking laterally is core to the story of life and evolutionary change that Quammen tells, key to which is horizontal gene transfer at the molecular level. The shape of the history of life is less like a tree above ground, he tells us, and more like a network that is ecologically structured. We now know that genes do not flow exclusively in one direction, vertically from parents to offspring. Genes, we've learned, can be traded laterally across the boundaries of species, even between what is called the kingdoms of life, that is to say, animals, plants, and fungi, among others. My purpose here is not to begin to explain this in any coherent detail, and in fact, I couldn't begin to do even if I wished to. But rather, what's important for us is that the paradigm of genetic exchange differs vastly from that of a single branching tree, proceeding in one direction only, vertically. In fact, the new model resonates with the discovery of the communication of trees via their root systems, laterally, horizontally. So for me, it offers another way of understanding Ray's vision of the chestnut tree, their daughter. Trees and humans are interrelated and more their kin, beautifully entangled with each other. Evidence supports the conclusion, as Richard Powers encapsulates it, that every organism alive today and those who have ever lived are members of a shared heritage that extends back to the origin of life 3.8 billion years ago. That is the principle of common ancestry. Part 3. Enlightenment and forest time. Forest time. Patricia Westerford, the scientist, Ray and Dorothy, the married couple, provide us with models of advocacy and action in late life on different scales. One international, Patricia Westerford, seeking out seeds around the world of trees, and Ray and Dorothy, their backyard. Mima Ma, whom I mentioned before, offers us another way of living our life in tandem with trees in late age. The novel opens, the very first page of the novel opens with the 70-some-year-old Mima Ma sheltering in a California park, leaning against the trunk of a pine tree. And this, for me, this image for me has become, in a sense, iconic, the leaning against a tree and finding a form of protection. This short scene is a page and a half, and it serves as a prolegomon to the novel. It's a parallel, and it's one that has tenacious roots in parallel with the long Buddhist cultural tradition prefiguring the attainment of enlightenment, hence enlightenment and forest time. But unlike the Buddha, who was in his 30s when he experienced illumination, meditating under a tree, Mimi Ma is old and in need of a sense of security and the absolution of understanding. So what does she do? She seeks out a tree. And I found in literary accounts, in memoirs, similar evocations of this. What does she do? She seeks out a tree, says the Buddha, as quoted in the overstory. A tree is a wondrous thing that shelters, feeds, and protects all living beings. In the evocative vocabulary of the overstory, all around her trees are raining down messages, speaking to her, and to her the pine tree says, "Listen, there's something you need to hear. It's the promise of a gospel." The novel follows her from childhood through significant moments in her life, as if the plot of her life were to learn from trees what she needs to know. And like the other main characters, she does. At the end of the long novel, we're returned to this scene. 500 pages from the beginning of the novel, she's still resting against the pine tree, which is a conduit of evolutionary knowledge and guidance. It's a refuge tree. She's absorbed the speech of this tree, her ears having tuned down to the lowest frequency, hearing the speech of trees that human ears are unable to hear normally, her mind having become a greener thing. It's a state of enlightenment, one in which, like Ray and Dorothy and Patricia Westerford, she envisions a regreening of the green world, one in which she ages into death, assisted by this tree. It's a form of assisted living, growing calm and peaceful, even as she shoulders a heavy burden of personal gift, which she accepts. The last message Mimi Ma receives is, this is the last message from the tree: be still and feel. She does. She is old growth. The first of the messages she hears, and they're all wise, is this: I love this. A good answer is worth inventing. I have to start over. A good answer is worth reinventing from scratch again and again. A good answer is worth reinventing from scratch again and again. It's an echo of what we've read earlier in the novel. It's a great idea, trees. So great that evolution keeps inventing it again and again. The same cannot be said for Homo sapiens, whose wanton destruction of the biosphere has caused so much death and increasingly threatens much of life on Earth. Evolution has not seen fit to invent humans again and again. And as the trees say elsewhere in the novel, long answers need long time. And that's exactly what's vanishing. Long answers need long time, and that's exactly what's vanishing. Long time is ambiguous, and especially so, perhaps, in our age of the Anthropocene. And here I turn to the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's written, I love his work, who's written in altogether illuminating ways about the imbrication of history and climate change. Very seminal thinker for many people. He distinguishes three different time scales: geological time, to the emergence and evolution of life on the planet, that's 4 billion years, and the time of world history or human history. In a previous essay, I suggested that to these three we add a fourth, the smallest measure, the human lifespan, a figure that at its outer limits is 125 years. For humans, geological time is the most abstract, and as a measure of temporality, it's not featured in the overstory. Instead, within the world of the overstory, long time is associated with his second time scale, the emergence and evolution of life on the planet, which is that long stretch of 4 billion years. This passage of life and time is virtually impossible, I think, for humans to comprehend, limited as we are by our own embodied sense of time. And so for me, one of the great gifts of the novel is to offer the time scale of the life and death of trees and of forests as a way to mediate the time scales of long geological time, the formation of the planet, to mediate that very abstract long time and our sense of time as human beings, where we're confined to thinking in terms of just a few generations, 2 or 3, often at the most. As opposed to geological time, which is as vast as it is abstract, the temporality of forest time is embodied in the varying lifespan of individual trees and in forests themselves. For in relation to the lifespan of trees, as I insisted earlier, we have a foreshortened sense of time, in part because our embodiment has a much shorter time than do the lifespans of various trees. And as we learn again and again throughout the novel, living with trees as if in and as part of a forest provides humans not only with kin, new kin, but also with a new sense of time, forest time, a new sense of time, time that's longer and time that's slower than that of Western capitalist time and human embodied time. Time dilates in the novel, offering humans the possibility of imagining time in scales beyond the human. At least that's how I believe my sense of time has been altered or deepened by this novel. Part 4, very short. Artwork and Indigenous knowledges. In the overstory, Powers gives the last word to Nick Hole, an artist who's now middle-aged. He's in an arboreal forest on the Pacific coast of North America, making a large-scale piece out of the remains. Remember, he's an artist, making a large-scale piece out of the remains of trees, when all of a sudden, he's in the midst of his work, he's surprised by a man indigenous to that space and place and time in the forest. This man's presence and his intimate knowledge of the land reminds us not only that everything in the forest is the forest, but also that the arboreal forest itself is indigenous. The forest is also a common ground in this part of the forest, a space for creativity and experimentation and making. It's a space, in the words of the feminist philosopher Rosie Braidotti, whose work, if you don't know, please read her book, Posthuman Knowledge, who just insists that there is such a space like this for collective affirmative praxis, that is to say, a gesture of undoing negativity which honors our collective obligations to come. Nick, with the indigenous man in the red coat and his two sons and yet another man who joins them, craft a sculpture out of the fallen branches of birch and spruce, pillow and wine, pine and willow. Pine and willow. It's something that can be seen from satellites circling the globe. It spells out the word still, still, a word that's been repeated throughout the novel. Still, meaning there's still time, meaning let's consider another perspective, meaning be quiet and do nothing, meaning the future is open-ended. Open-ended, that just strikes me as a curious formulation containing, as it does, opposites that may nonetheless, like old growth, open-ended, hold a truth. And this is the way that Powers concludes the overstory, on a note of hope, representing solidarity in the making of a totem as testament to the wonder that is the forest, that is to say, to life. A few closing remarks. I opened my remarks by suggesting that we study aging across species with a potential focus on life expectancy and lifespan. I'm acutely aware, however, that I've been speaking primarily, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, from the point of view of human needs. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? This question too long has been posed from the point of view of humans. Today we can say that other trees would be aware of its falling. Extending a healthy life expectancy for both humans and trees is, I would argue, an intrinsic good, valuable in and of itself. Human life expectancy has doubled over the last century, which is a remarkable achievement. And it's also an achievement that's been recently disrupted by increasing health disparities and also from the disastrous fallout from COVID-19. But trees, I've read somewhere, and I don't remember where, that we know very, very little about the aging of trees. And to my knowledge, there's no aggregate global measures of life expectancies for different species. But we do know, without a shadow of a doubt, that for trees, life expectancy has plunged with the enormous and ongoing destruction of forests, only one measure of the loss. Inarguably, such devastation at the loss of the hands of humans, even as there are those who are working to extend the human lifespan, which is a delusional quest that would further disrupt the precarious balance of the web of life on the planet. I stand opposed to that form of extending the lifespan of humans. In the overstory, understanding forest time gives rise to understanding of human time, which is to say the upper biological limit of the lifespan of our species. And one of the lessons of the overstory, it is an implicit lesson, but we can draw it out, I think, is that we must allow the coevolution of species. Evolution is a major theme in the novel, to do its work over long time, not human time. Not only do trees have longer lifespans than do humans, in evolutionary time, they existed for eons before Homo sapiens. As Diana Beresford Kroger puts it, she's the Canadian research scientist, also not really allowed to practice her research, who has a background, having been born and raised in Ireland, in Celtic stories and practices in the company of trees. As she puts it in scientific terms, of the foundational building blocks of life, trees create the atmosphere of oxygen, crucial to the survival of humans. Trees don't simply maintain the conditions necessary for human and most animal life on Earth. Trees create those conditions through the community of forests, she writes, in To Speak for the Trees. The photosynthetic reaction is the reverse of ordinary breathing, she reminds us. This means that plants and animals and humans are connected by chemistry, by oxygen and carbon dioxide. These two molecules conduct life and death. Understanding our interdependence is crucial, wrote Thoreau. I quote him for the third or fourth time. Old trees are our parents. Let's be clear, we're killing our parents. It's a monstrous act. It's parricide and matricide, and it's a form of suicide. It's particularly egregious, I think, to cut down trees which have attained a venerable age to decimate old growth. I'd say it's a sacrilege. In closing, I want to add a word about the literary imagination. I mentioned earlier that for their first anniversary, Ray finds himself confounded about what gift to give Dorothy. What would rise to the level of what she has given him? The best he decides is to give her a thing that grows, and he chooses a tree. As we're reminded in the novel, the word book comes from the word beach. And I know a lot of you are doing work in literary studies. A novel is also a thing that grows. It grows from an idea, an image, an object, a seed, a feeling. The overstory gives life to ideas that have taken root, branching in multiple directions, above ground and below ground, connecting with other books. Thanks to the overstory, I've read a myriad other books and articles about trees, and I've thought about longevity and aging in new ways. My intellectual life has expanded, and so has my walking life. My intellectual life has expanded in ways before I ever could have imagined. I've branched out, and I understand the pun involved in that. I also find myself in welcome and warm admiration of people I do not know, who've given us the gift of their research and experience along their long lives in forests, including Suzanne Simard. She's also a Canadian researcher about trees, author of The Mother Tree, 62. Diana Beresford Kroger, whom I've mentioned several times, 77. And German forester, whom I know some of you are aware of his work, German forester Peter Wohlleben, 58. I'm grateful that they wrote for a public audience, and I hope that some of you are understanding your own research as research that will be destined for a public audience, for public scholarship, as we call it in the United States. Thanks to that work and to that of many, many, many others, work with regard to trees and to forests and the environment and aging, the potential impact of the overstory is enhanced by having appeared at a moment when so many in the cultural sphere have been contributing to revelatory conversation about trees and forests. I firmly believe that we're today at an inflection point where knowledge is being diffused rapidly, engendering compelling conversations, fresh insights, and new states of mind. New states of mind, old growth, new kin, forest time. And as you may wonder, as for my own state of mind, reading the overstory for me is like taking a long walk in the woods. And I want to return to this novel over and over, or even perhaps like living in the forest. It's the promise of a feeling of sanctuary. And in the overstory, we're offered the gift of seeing both the trees and the forests for the same time. So that includes my remark, but one of the things I want to say before we shift into discussion is that for quite a few years, I was director of Center for the Humanities, which is something that we have at many universities and colleges across the United States. And there are several as well in the Anglophone world. I directed a Center for 20th Century Studies. It was called Center for the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin. And our auditorium looked very, very much like your auditorium. I loved that auditorium. And it was hard for me to leave that auditorium when I moved to the University of Washington 20 years ago. We don't have an auditorium like this, I'm sorry to say. So I felt very much at home being able to see you, to see some of your expressions. I'm very grateful that the camera was turned. And I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my thinking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Your passionate, heartwarming talk.
Hard to hear. Can I ask you a question? Do you have the possibility of simultaneous interpretation in the back in this auditorium?
We don't, well, we don't need it. Everybody speaks English.
No, I know, but you know, my treasured auditorium had the possibility
Oh,
for simultaneous translation.
There's that possibility that I'm told. I think the sound connection was bad a few seconds ago. I just wanted to thank you for this heartwarming and very passionate talk. I know that everybody here has been listening with great attention and great admiration. And next thing we know, next thing we'll do here, for those of us who haven't read Overstory, I'm sure we're going to read it. And I don't want to get in between you and the audience. Please, your comments and your questions, they're welcome for now for Dr. Woodward. Question?
Oh dear, can't hear. Not yet.
No, no.
Mhm. May I, before you begin, can I stop you before you even begin? I appreciate Dr. Woodward, but please call me Kathy if if you're comfortable doing so.
Yeah, okay. Still, yeah, I guess now. Right?
Dear Professor, thank you again for this wonderful talk. I personally benefited much from it because while I was doing my research, while preparing for this conference, I came across a lot of your articles and books, and I benefited there as well. So it was like a double check for me, if you like. Thank you. And my question is, especially in the second part of your talk, you mentioned that the character accepts the tree as his daughter, and that was an interesting part. Maybe that kind of mindset is the one that we all need as humans nowadays in the 21st century, in this era. I don't think you mentioned.
I'm afraid to have to interrupt you again, which is to say the sound is not really coming across. It's very, very diffuse. And I really catch maybe 1 out of every 8 words. So sorry. It sounded like there were a lot of compliments in the beginning. So leading up to the question.
Come here and can you do that? Why don't you try it?
I think this is a marathon.
I thought I was just.
Is there any way to lower the camera?
Is it any better now?
I see your hand.
I will come there. Okay. That microphone.
Does this work?
I think it's. Oh.
So should I repeat my question, dear Professor?
Oh, definitely.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. Very briefly, I mentioned that in the second section of your talk, you referred to the character who accepts the tree as his daughter, and I found that really impressive, emotional and interesting. And also in the following times, you mentioned that the lifespan of trees, which is really long, may or should inspire us humans who have the fear of death. So I'm actually curious about your opinion on the global world and our possibility to change this fear of death by benefiting from the lifespan of trees. Maybe your answer will include the capital system and its profit-based approaches, but is there a chance for us to really shift our understanding of longevity by getting some help from nature? I mean, is this realistically possible for us? This was my question. Thank you.
So I think I've grasped the essence of the question. You spoke of, I think, emotional attachment in one part of the paper, and then fear of death and the possibility of attenuating the fear of death by attachment to nature. Am I seeing a hand there raised by the gentleman in the front? I I definitely would say yes, absolutely. And I would point to some other passages in novels and in memoirs that speak to this connection between nature and, notwithstanding the critique of nature, let's just call it nature, connections with life that is continuing to grow, connection with what some might find sentimental. I don't. I find it fundamental. Connection to growing plants in one's home, inside. One of the lovely passages in a book by the British writer Diana Athill, in one of her memoirs, is of her mentioning how gardening, which she took up thanks to her mother, in the footsteps of her mother. It's called something like Toward the End. She's gardening and she talks about, and the reason I'm going like this is because she talks about how for her it is fundamentally a good and very refreshing and nourishing for her to help the roots of plants feel comfortable. In other words, she's planting these plants, and that connection gives her something to attend to herself, as well as having herself attended to. I have another favorite passage, and I hope this is something that's relevant at this point and that I understood the question correctly, and thank you very much. Is from a writer named Helen Bevington. It's a single woman. She knew her life was going to be solitary when she was older. And what she did is simple, and for me, it's iconic. She found a large enough plant that for her became, in her apartment, a tree. She knew she would be reading books, and this is the tree for her to sit under while she reads books. No fear of death, or at least not that they are telling us of. And this is a theme that I've seen repeated, in addition to the fact that one thing that's very, very clear as well in the novel The Overstory is that time does not proceed in only one direction. That is to say, life to death. It does proceed in that direction, but it also has feedback loops. And if you think of a tree shows its age by growing its diameter as well. So instead of from life to death, we have time that is being traced in circular terms, putting the lie to the fact that time only moves in one direction. I'm sure there's science that corroborates that too on an intergalactic scale. But if there is, and I knew it, I wouldn't be able to explain it in any case. Again, if I understood you correctly, and we're working all of this out on these platforms, in a few years, it's going to be fantastic. We're still at the experimental stage. I just came from a conference myself where it was hybrid the whole way, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So my apologies for not having possibly a good understanding of the question, but I appreciate what I thought I understood.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, I have got a lot of glimpses of what I meant in my question. I think I got the answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I had seen other hands up. Yeah, yes, Trevor. Probably. Shall we try with the mic again?
Yes, because otherwise it's impossible.
Okay, let me just try this and see if this is working.
We'll have the nonsense of me responding to something that you didn't say at all.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for what I found both a very intellectually inspiring talk and also a very moving one. In some ways, I think I'm going to repeat elements of the last question. So I hope you don't mind me pushing you further on that. And I hope this won't seem hostile, because it's really not meant to be a hostile question. But in its bluntest form, I guess the question I might like to ask is life the ultimate good? In a sense, that comes out of your use of the refrain from Emerson, right? We're killing our parents. And I share the sense of ethical horror that I think you were expressing in what you also pointed out is a suicidal act. But just again, I think you were addressing this in your answer to the last question. There are also times in which we need to acknowledge and accept the death of our parents. And I guess in more abstract theoretical terms, I'm wondering if you think that there's possibly a more general problem of the vitalism that sometimes underpins ecological thought. And again, therefore, how we address the questions of the entanglement of the processes of life and processes of death. And just to bring you back to one point in your paper, I thought the most interesting place where you addressed the question of death was the idea of sacrifice and self-sacrifice. Now, on the one hand, I think that possibly raises a set of questions for a Turkish audience, for us as a Turkish audience, about the non-secular elements of this thought. That's a bit of a distraction, however, but it suggests that there are processes of destruction and self-destruction which are inherent in the processes of the material world around us. Sometimes, of course, I think on a couple of occasions you refer to that as the living world. I'm resisting calling it the living world because it's also the dying world, right? So again, I guess my question would be, in abstract terms, is there a possible problem of vitalism in ecological thought? And in more silly, blunt terms, is life therefore the ultimate good, or in what ways might we complicate the idea that life is the ultimate good?
So I must have really misunderstood the first question. Thank you very much for that. I wish I'd been able to see you ask the question, but I did, I think I did hear most of it. So thank you very much for that. It didn't feel hostile. Oh, look at that. Hello. Hello. I'm very happy to meet you.
Hello, nice to meet you.
It didn't feel hostile at all. I have to say, I think that I have gone through myself a bit of change. And whereas I myself would not have associated myself with vitalism, I think I am moving more in that direction. I found myself very taken with the work of Michael Martyr, who's a philosopher, plant philosopher. And I lifted, I think I even might have said this, but I lifted the phrase, life is what grows, from some of his work, which he borrowed from Luce Irigaray, whose work I do not follow at all, but somehow in the transmission, this struck me as a lovely phrase, which allows us to accept something and not have to poke at the definition all of the time. So, but is life the ultimate good? It's posed as if there are only two possibilities, life and death. And I would call life a good. I wouldn't certainly call it the ultimate good, because there are times when of course, death alleviates suffering. And in addition, although you're right, there was an emphasis on growth in my paper, particularly when it comes to aging, to emphasize the notion of growth as something positive and possible. But at the same time, the idea and the practice of trees, taking a look at the benefactor trees, which in fact provide their remains so that more can grow. It might be the so that you would like to think about with me, that we might think about that so that, which does hint at an ecology, and you may have some reservations about that. I am an ardent follower of Gregory Bateson. I love his book, Towards an Ecology of Being. So backing up, I certainly didn't mean to think and to say that death is also fundamental. And that's another reason why I wanted to, in this paper, and maybe in a longer version, I wanted to really focus on this novel as providing me a way to argue against people who are for life extension when it comes to aging and productivity, and let's extend human life another 300,000 million years. I mean, I'm exaggerating now, probably not to effect, but I stand opposed to that. And in part for what you might yourself be thinking as well, I'm just going to ask if you would take some time to perhaps not flesh out a question, but if you've got something that you would like to add in terms of how you see these things, please take the floor.
I don't think I have a very sophisticated way of thinking about these things, but I guess the best I could do in my question was to talk about problems of the entanglement of life and death.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there's a broader set of worries in the background behind my worries about vitalism, I think. I think it's also to do with the normalization of certain kinds of life. And okay, I'm going to play it both ways on this point, the pathologization of certain kinds of life, but also the ethical notions that we attach to pathology itself. Perhaps it's not bad to be pathological in a certain sense. So yeah, I'm hinting incoherently at broader worries that I wish I could flesh out more coherently for you behind my worries about vitalism.
So I have to say, this is one of the most wonderful times I've ever had the feeling of being able to have a conversation with someone in this context. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
You might find yourself then, if you know Jane Bennett's book, Vital Matter.
I should definitely go away.
Yeah, I found myself just so annoyed in the beginning by the book, and by the end, that's when she becomes more ecological in thought. I come to accept her, but I don't know about rocks and life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we have more questions. I have seen some other people earlier. Linda?
Thanks for finding a solution to this problem. I think you've frozen for me on my side.
Kathy, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So my question, well, first of all, thank you very much for your most illuminating talk, and I find it, I also find it very emotional. And
Oh.
well, you talked about trees as a part of the ecological habitat we're surrounded with more. But how about the possible aspects of political, possible political aspects of trees? Well, the relationship between trees and humans, well, other than the forcing of the capitalist system and cutting off the trees and so on and so forth. And do you think trees in relation to memory and well, do you think this might lead to some kind of a process of politicization of nature in terms of cutting of the cutting off the continuation of cultural memory?
Wait, what was the last phrase? The cutting of?
The continuation of cultural memory of oneself or one nation, I don't know.
You know, you're at what has become my favorite microphone, but I still had trouble hearing what you said.
Well, I'll try once again.
I'm sorry.
No. Well, in your talk, you focused on the trees as part of the habitat we're surrounded with as humans. I mean, this is how the novel deals with the trees, I guess. And my question is that, do you think, I mean, apart from the novel, but there is a kind of politic aspect of trees in relation with cultural memory of a state, of a person as well? I mean, do you think cutting off the trees or planting them even has political connotations as well? Could that be possible?
Well, in fact, as you say, there is the practice in, I don't know, perhaps this is cultures around the world. There is, in fact, the practice of planting trees in the wake of a death, for example, to create a memory that is symbolic and can be associated with the state as well as a lost soul. Absolutely true. The planting of trees has also become a practice that is in part serving, say, all kinds of financial interests. As a performative practice of being virtuous, you will see corporations will say, and we have planted a tree for every one of the X numbers of things that we have sold, etc. I hope you're following me. It's the appropriation of the practice of planting a tree, which means nothing if it's planted in plantation style, one monoculture. This does virtually no good whatsoever. These are trees that don't survive. They can't live out their lifespan, etc. And I find that practice, the appropriation of the planting of trees, to be as important in terms of not doing the kind of work that I would want the planting of trees to do, as that kind of work. I hope I'm communicating something there. So
Thank you.
I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I can see now this is very interesting to me because I have a slight image of my image and my books. So you can see my books, some of them, which are my tree books. Some of my tree books are right here. And I want you all to have a similar library. And if I could, boom, I'd send you all copies. There is a lovely and very strange book that is called How I Became a Tree. How I Became a Tree by Sumana Roy. It's both magical and grounded, and it's unusual and strange and just makes you think differently. So thank you for showing me that.
Thank you so much again for giving us a very insightful view of trees and what it means to live with consciousness of trees, because we're all mostly urban people here, and I think our awareness of trees is very limited. I mean, when I was reading the overstory, I had to look up in the dictionary for many, many times for all those huge variety of trees. So I realized how poor I was in appreciating this richness. Thank you for reminding us of our entanglements. And that is, I think, our realization of these entanglements is the only way to move beyond our loneliness as Homo sapiens, because we have become a very lonely species on Earth. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening and for your contributions and questions also. And Kathy, it's
Thank you.
from miles away, you have enlivened our conference, our symposium. Thank you so much.
So good night. Good night. Good night, I'm saying. Good night. Thanks very much.
Let's see.
Okay. So I'll say goodbye. Okay, I'll just say goodbye. It seems awful to just turn you off. So,
It's not a problem. It's not a problem. We
So-
finished that presentation.
so Funda, would it be possible to have the names of the people, the two people who asked questions
Yes, of course.
at some point?
Should I mail you or?
Just email me when you have a chance.
Okay, I'll send you. the
That'd be
names.
great. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you very much for everything, Kathy.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
So nice. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.